This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, and the Israel Institute, enhancing the knowledge and study of modern Israel. I am Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dalia Shenlin.
Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. But before we start, we'd like to introduce a cool new feature. Our guests and topics often spark interesting discussions online, but they're scattered around Facebook, Twitter, and direct emails to us. Now we're creating a special Patreon post for each episode where you can ask follow-up questions or discuss the topics with other listeners. We will link to the post directly in each episode's show notes. Just find where your podcast app puts the show notes, click on the link, and you'll get directly to the post. Then Dalia and I will review the comments and address the most interesting ones in the following episode. You don't have to be a supporter of the show to join the discussion, even though we encourage that greatly. But just go to patreon.com/Tel Aviv Review. And as always, you can of course support us by joining our Patreon campaign and becoming a patron, because every little helps.
We're very happy to welcome our guest today. Christopher Browning is a professor emeritus of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's one of the foremost scholars of the Holocaust. He's written 8 books in total, among them his 1992 book, Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Final Solution in Poland, was both highly acclaimed and controversial, and in many ways changed the way scholars and people have been thinking about and understanding the Holocaust. He's also written The Origins of the Final Solution, a volume as part of Yad Vashem's multi-volume history of the Holocaust, published in 2004, those among his many other books. Professor Browning recently participated in an event at the Van Leer Institute entitled Refugees, Genocide, and Trials in the 20th Century. And we're very happy to welcome you to the show today, Professor Christopher Browning. Welcome.
Thank you for the invitation.
Let me start with a question that might be a little bit sensationalist, but I'm sure you've been asked this. Can anyone be a killer?
Almost anyone.
Tell us why.
Just empirically looking at how many different kinds of people became killers for the Nazis and how few people didn't. The Holocaust is basically a history that has many to victims and many to perpetrators, and far too few people who ever said no. So in a sense, our problem with the Holocaust is to explain, and the more difficult thing is to explain the few people that somehow managed, against all the trends, to refuse to participate, while most people went along, did what was expected of them, and became part of the problem.
So in the introduction to your keynote speech at the Van Leer Institute, Professor Yehuda Bauer said that he characterized your work as a form of microhistory as opposed to, I guess, big historical forces. And I think anybody reading Ordinary Men understands that, but how would you characterize that term? Is that a fair term?
I would say yes, not entirely. I mean, Origins of the Final Solution is a more standard narrative that covers 1939 to 1942 in a fairly conventional way. But 3 of my books have focused on particular topics with the hope that they would illuminate much far bigger issues. My first was a study of the German Foreign Office and the Final Solution, and that was looking at the so-called Jewish desk. Each German bureaucracy had its little collection of Jewish experts, because every organization wanted to be able to participate in the shaping of Jewish policy, knew it was important, and didn't want to be left out. And so I wanted to look at one group. This is a group of 5 or 6 men. I studied that for my dissertation in the early 70s. These were people that all had university law degrees, except one who had a PhD in anthropology and had been a year abroad at the University of Kansas in the United States. They all joined the Nazi Party in March of 1933, once they were in. So they figured the way to make their law career work was to become joiners very quickly. And when they found their way to the so-called Jewish desk, most of them became self-made anti-Semites. Not much evidence that they were concerned with this issue before, but the man who, when he was appointed the director of that desk writes to every publisher in Germany asking for their anti-Semitic books and does a crash study on how to become a professional anti-Semite.
Meaning I have to be an anti-Semite now that the Nazi Party is gaining power.
Yeah. And I did study this exactly at the same time as in the United States. You had the team players of the Watergate. All of them had University of Southern California law degrees or from some other place. They all became, quote, the team players. That's how they described themselves. Joined the team. And they basically were going to do whatever was necessary to get President Nixon reelected, regardless of the rules and the laws, and profit from that personally as well, but also be part of a bigger mission, a bigger cause. So I was struck at that time just how parallel. Fortunately, the American bureaucratic criminals had much less dangerous goals than mass murder, just a subversion of democracy. But
But
the dynamics of the behavior was so similar.
Exactly. With all due respect to Nixon's administration, of course, there was something a lot more, as you said, a lot more monstrous about the Holocaust in a way that up until then, and even to a large extent since then, it's been described in some sort of like metaphysical, or almost metaphysical way. I mean, there was like this evil, monstrous, devilish element to the Holocaust. Do you see that at all in your scholarship?
I think it's very important to understand the Holocaust as a man-made event. This is not a natural disaster. This is something that human beings did to other human beings, and it's a result of human behavior. And so I think it's very important not to sort of say the devil made us do it. That's the cop-out, that we do have to understand that while the scale of the monstrosity of the event is unparalleled, nonetheless, the people who did it, and this is getting back to Hannah Arendt, the chasm between the mediocrity of the people who do it and the horrific evil of what they create or what they accomplish is there, but we have to understand that's a human activity. That's a human product.
Did it surprise you when you came across this fact that they were just ordinary men? I mean, in post-Hannah Arendt, was it something that was
As usual, Gilad speaks for me because I had the same question. I mean, were you deeply influenced by Arendt's thinking about this?
Partly, yes. That is, I had read her Eichmann in Jerusalem. In fact, that was the first book I read on the Holocaust, and I didn't know all the things that I would later come to challenge and not agree with.
It might have been the first book I read on the Holocaust as an adult because we had lots of children's Holocaust literature growing up.
Yeah. So it was my entree, but from that I immediately read Raoul Hilberg's Destruction of the European Jews, and that was my conversion experience. That was the book that changed my life and turned me into a Holocaust scholar. So I was very quickly beyond that into what Hilberg basically portrays the Holocaust as a vast bureaucratic administrative process. This is not a pogrom writ large over Europe. This is a systematic, step-by-step, legalized, bureaucratized, administered persecution that culminates in the attempt to totally annihilate the Jews of Europe. And I think that was the framework. When you speak in those frames, of course, the perpetrators remain kind of faceless. And so I was trying to put faces on the bureaucrats with the first book. And so that was a case study to look at a collection of the bureaucrats. The second was the study of a mobile killing unit. These people that go around and basically spend their day shooting people or rounding them up and driving them onto the trains that will take them to Treblinka. And I was very fortunate. I got the historian's windfall, that eureka moment that we all wait for in the archives after years of sitting and looking at document after document. When I came across the indictment for Reserve Police Battalion, the trial of Reserve Police 101. And what was just so stunning was the witness who described when they were taken to the village of Józefów on July 13th, 1942, which was going to be their first killing action. They've just arrived in Poland. They've never done this before. They didn't know that's why what they were going to do. And the major of the unit has to explain to them what's going to happen. And so he gives a series of justifications. And then at the end he says, if these are a reserve unit of middle-aged men, if any of you older men don't feel up to, you can step out. And just a handful of people take up his offer and turn in their rifles. So here was a case where people without indoctrination, without any higher percentage of party membership than anybody in Nazi German society. Coming from the city of Hamburg, which was one of the least Nazified cities, the Nazis derisively referred to it as Red Hamburg because the socialists and the communists and labor unions were very strong there. From an age group which was too young to have been brutalized in World War I, too old to have been raised and schooled in the Nazi bubble, that is their pre-Hitler youth, pre-Nazi schooling. And they came mostly from the working class, which was the group that voted in the lowest percentages for the Nazis. So if you were trying to find a collection of people least likely to become killers for Hitler, it would have been middle-aged working class people from Hamburg.
And even I think you point out that the threat of punishment if they were not to go along with this doesn't really materialize.
And receive a very explicit offer from their commander, they don't have to do this. And overwhelmingly, the battalion does. Over time, more people take up the major's offer. And I estimated that probably close to 20% became what I called the evaders, people that either didn't at the beginning or stopped taking part in the direct killing actions, but they'd do everything else. They would round up people in the ghettos. They would be the cordons around the killing actions so nobody could escape. But they just couldn't pull the trigger point blank and blow people's heads open at point blank range. So the issue there really was, how do people become face-to-face killers when they're just randomly picked off the streets of Hamburg from the least promising material that you could possibly imagine? And to find stunningly that most people do that even when they're offered the chance without any disadvantage or punishment to step out and not take part. So that was the second case study, micro-history we might call it. And the third was to look at a collection of labor camps in a small town in south-central Poland, Jewish ghetto of Wierbsznik, and it bordered on the Polish industrial town of Strakowice. And when the ghetto is cleared, about 25 to 30% of the population, in fact, is taken into the labor camps. So there's a very high number of survivors. I had 292 different people giving one or more testimonies who had survived the labor camps. So it was a unique opportunity to have a large number of testimonies about a single ghetto and a single set of camps and to explore the whole corporate Holocaust. These were not SS camps. These are camps built by corporate Germany who had confiscated Polish factories and rented these prisoners by contract from the SS. These were slaves, property of the SS, rented by contract from the SS by corporate Germany, put into camps built by corporate Germany, guarded by a security force hired by corporate Germany. And this was, in a sense, to look at a kind of camp that had gone under the radar. I mean, we knew about the big ghettos, Warsaw, Łódź. We knew about the big camps like Auschwitz. But there were literally thousands of these little labor camps attached to virtually every German enterprise that was having a go of it. This was like with Schindler. I mean, we know about Schindler's camp but he was the exception in terms of how he ran it. But there were Schindler camps, multiple Schindler camps in virtually every town in Poland.
And this is probably one of the reasons why, as you pointed out in the Van Leer lecture, there has been a sort of school of Holocaust studies that focuses specifically on the economics of it.
Yes, that's one of the things that has come on in the 1990s, that the whole issue of both property and economic considerations initially was not a major factor that we studied because, of course, the killing actions and some of the others seem so much more important. I mean, it's not unreasonable that this would not be the first thing to look at. But certainly our understanding of the economics of the Holocaust and of the corrupting effect of confiscation and distribution of property in many different ways, to get away from that question that was always asked early, who paid for Hitler? Did big business hire Hitler?
I mean, this machine has to function. It has to be
it turns out that big business puts money into all candidates to cover all their bets, and they weren't any more particularly pro-Hitler than they were pro-conservative. But once Hitler is in and is distributing the spoils, the need to be at the trough and to make sure none of your competitors gets more Jewish property than you do, none of your competitors confiscates more property in Poland and gets more slave labor than you do, becomes part of capitalist enterprise under a Nazi dictatorship.
What about another relatively newish school of scholarship on the Holocaust that seeks to perhaps position it in a broader network of genocides in the 20th century and before that, as opposed to those who would like to see the Holocaust as this unique insular episode in 20th century history? What's your take on that?
Back when I was first getting into it, and particularly the 70s and 80s, a lot of the concern was on defining the uniqueness of the Holocaust. And uniqueness is a word I don't think many historians like because it seems to apply a kind of metaphysical category rather than a historical category. So we looked for what we would call what was unprecedented about it, what was singular about it, what differentiated it from other terrible atrocities of the Nazis. And so I would say the Holocaust got contextualized in three ways. One was to look at the non-Jewish victims of the Holocaust and how did Nazi persecution and mass killing of other groups of people compare to the fate of the Jews, and how do each of those killing programs illuminate the other? How do they help us understand more? And for instance, we know that the army presided over prisoner of war camps in which 3.25 million Soviet POWs perished. If Hitler had been shot in the spring of 1942, the death of the Soviet prisoners of war would have been his biggest killing list. The Jews would have not been the number one body count of the Nazi regime.
I think you also described that the big plan in Barbarossa was to starve them all to death, right?
Yeah, the plans were for even much more than that. And it turns out that they in the end, didn't control the country well enough to starve as many people as they had hoped to. There were limits to their power.
They were inspired by Stalin.
While they were still fighting a war. Yeah, they couldn't in fact, because they had to fight a war at the same time, they couldn't in fact starve as many people as Stalin starved intentionally. So we learned, of course, then that the army was not only key in the Holocaust, but the army presided over millions of captured prisoners and non-combatants who perished at their hands. The T4 program, the killing of physically and mentally handicapped, they are the first victims of gassing. The first people the Nazis gassed are Germans. And it is the people who ran that program that are then sent to run the Operation Reinhardt camps. So these people have become mass murderers before they ever killed a Jew. They had already killed tens of thousands of Germans, and then with their expertise, they are sent to Poland where they become key staff members of Operation Reinhardt. So looking at what Nazis did to other groups and to find that you had equal opportunity killers, people that could kill Soviet POWs and Jews, could kill mentally ill and Jews, forced us to realize that the issue of Nazi racism is broader. Anti-Semitism is part of a bigger picture.
Well, clearly you're touching on one of the biggest controversies in the field, although you've identified many controversies, many polarizing controversies. But it seems like one of the biggest ones, at least regarding your work, is this debate of, let's call it the naturally grown killer, like people who can become killers over the course because of these social processes, versus what some people have criticized as a one-dimensional caricature of Germans as sort of congenital anti-Semites. And this is, obviously kind of the debate between you and Daniel Jonah Goldhagen. What would you say is the strongest evidence on your side and on what Goldhagen has argued for this unique racist German mentality?
Yes, basically, it isn't hard to intuitively come up with a sense of national character. We basically, just the way in which human beings manage masses of information we get, is we try to find the simplest categories that allow us to grasp stuff. So it's very normal, I think, for us to think in terms of national character. In a sense, that was what Daniel Goldhagen's approach was, that Germans were different than any other group in Europe. They were all anti-Semitic, but the German anti-Semitism was a very different kind, a murderous eliminationist anti-Semitism that made it for, as he put it, basically 95% of the Germans, killing Jews was something that was not only justified and necessary, but something they did with gusto and enthusiasm and enjoyed their torturing of their victims. And it isn't hard to line up all sorts of survivor testimony that attest to the gratuitous cruelty, the horrific human behavior that they confronted. The question for me then is, are we at the beginning or is that the end of the process? And while I have no doubt on the survivors' testimonies of the absolutely horrific people they encountered, the issue is, did they do it because they were already horrible people, or did they become horrible people in the process of the escalating Nazi persecution? And particularly once the killing starts, we try to explain human behavior. Certainly one is that ideas can produce action. If you believe something about Jews, you can behave towards Jews in a certain way.
And you can be brought to believe those things if you are trained.
But we also know that that's a two-way street, and what you see and what you do can alter and shape what you believe. And for the case of Police Battalion 101, when you draft these random middle-aged working-class people on the streets of Germany and put them in Poland, the first killing is absolutely traumatic. They're distraught, traumatized. They don't understand what this is.
They start drinking.
They start drinking heavily. But the horror of it is how quickly they got used to it. And the battalion, I think, sort of breaks into roughly three groups. There's a group of evaders, the people that take up the commander's offer and kind of withdraw from the very worst aspects, which is pulling the trigger. A group of accommodators or compliers. They simply do whatever they're told. But there is a group that learns to enjoy what they're doing, learns to enjoy being professional killers. This, I think, is the group that, of course, sticks in the memory of survivors and is the product, people who produce the gratuitous cruelty that is then imprinted and left in the memories, and it's easy to see the part for the whole. What I think Voltagen did was he mistook the part for the whole, and that this group, which is there, for him becomes the image of 95% of Germans. I think, it is a group that, grows and develops, becomes what they are. They're not there to start with, and they represent a minority whose impact is out of all proportion to their numbers within the unit. Because, of course, they have the license and the encouragement and the freedom to do this, and they will be the people who push the envelope. They're the ones that are going to set the pace and become the go-getters that are at the, I guess the term would be the cutting edge of what the battalion is doing.
So based on your understanding of the Holocaust, what do you think about drawing parallels between that historical episode and current affairs, which is something that's been going on, especially since 2016, and you weighed in on this in an essay in the New York Review of Books, looking at the Holocaust as, at the end of the day, a very human endeavor, invites, in a way, us to draw parallels to other human endeavors like our life at the moment.
Yes. Part of the uses of history is that it will help us to understand what's happening now because we've seen and understand better about where we came from and how we got here. So I'm certainly not against using historical parallels and historical analogies. On the other hand, I think we have to be very precise about it and not to politicize or exploit or misuse past analogies for cheap political purposes now.
How do you identify that misuse?
Well, that's...
Or you know it when you see it.
You do by being careful, just by making sure you're using the right words and you understand what the historical analogies are that you're dealing with. Certainly the one that's bouncing around right now, of course, is the term concentration camp. Because Alicia Cortez sent out I forget what was a tweet or whatever, but basically said what's on the southern border is our concentration camps and said never again, which of course immediately refers to the Holocaust, but she didn't call them Nazi camps. And immediately then there was criticism, one, that the concentration camps where 6 million people died and it's total trivialization.
Which in itself is rather a historic mischaracterization.
Yeah. So in a sense, when I got into that, I said several things. One, the history of the concentration camp dates back to Cuba and the Boer War, and that this is not a Nazi invention. When the Nazis did take it over, they had brutality and cruelty and death rates in there that exceeded anything remotely what's happening in detention centers on our southern border. And above all, the Holocaust did not take place in the concentration camps. They took place in the death camps in Poland, and that Americans confuse that, I think, primarily only because at the end of the war, when Jews are evacuated out of Poland from the labor camps and survivors, they are dumped into the concentration camps in Germany that had been created to hold political prisoners, not racial prisoners. And that they're all there in the mix at Dachau or Bergen-Belsen or Buchenwald, which had been cleared of Jews for years until they're brought back in at the very end. And so when American troops liberate Dachau, half the population are these Jews that have been marched all over, and the assumption was immediately that they're just part of the concentration camp population, which historically only happened at the very end and is basically wrong.
But there's a broader question here, which is that the fact that the Holocaust is really the sum total of our references, right? It's certainly in Israel, to a large extent in the rest of the Western world. We always draw parallels to the Holocaust. And this is a question that I actually asked Timothy Snyder when he was a guest on this podcast, when his book On Tyranny came out, which is full of references to Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. And I asked him, why always going back to those two examples? And he said, well, that's my expertise. And I would like to ask you, whether you think that your expertise as a Holocaust historian actually necessitates you in a way to say, no, history does not begin and end in the Holocaust.
Yeah, I would say more of what I've done is to say, please don't make this cheap analogy because it does more harm than good. In this case, I think when Cortez did that, it shifted the attention away from the horrible things happening in the detention camps, and she and her use of the word then became the center, and everything revolved around our debate of what does a concentration camp, not what our government is doing in detention centers on the border.
That's true, but I have to say I thought it was a very educational debate going around because there was lots more clarification of some of the things you just mentioned on social media where you would never expect it. But it's an aside because I agree with you that it distracted.
And my biggest intervention in the politics was this article I did for the New York Review of Books, well, now it's about 9 months ago. And there I tried to be absolutely clear that when we look at Hitler and the Nazis, the main hallmarks of them are totalitarian dictatorship, war, and genocide. And our current situation, fortunately, does not include any of those. We can see lots of fascist style, but we fortunately do not yet see what was the historical essence of Nazism, which was dictatorship, war, and genocide. But what we do see, and this is what we shouldn't, again, just as we shouldn't take our eye off what's happening in these detention camps, we shouldn't take our eye off what's happening in the United States, which is an assault upon democracy, an assault upon the Constitution, an undermining of all sorts of norms that make democracy function. And that I said this was part of a wider movement of what I call, not only I, in fact, what Viktor Orban coins as the term illiberal democracy. How do we preserve the shell and the appearance of it and basically gut the substance of it so that people think they are living in a democracy when in fact they're not? How do you have elections but make the elections meaningless? How do you have a judiciary but gradually erode its independence so it is reduced to being a political arm of the government? How do you allow a free press but make the news it carries utterly ineffective in terms of how it changes the opinions of a significant part of the population who can dismiss it as, quote, fake news? These are the real problems we're confronting right now.
Right. So in a way, what you're saying is that it's worth looking at these historical comparisons, not to say what we're going through now is quantitatively as bad as genocide or the Holocaust, but that we need to identify the entire social processes that are either diminishing to democracy at one end and truly destructive at the other end. And by the way, I just have to give a little credit where credit is due. The term illiberal democracy was written about by Fareed Zakaria in the early 1990s. I came up with a great article on it.
Oh, okay.
So he definitely scooped Orban.
Yes.
But
it should be the Prime Minister of Hungary now.
Yeah.
So would you agree with that characterization of a better use for historic comparisons?
Yes. I mean, in the sense if we know the history, we can see what it is the real danger right now and not go chasing after illusions. And if your yardstick is don't be alarmed unless unless you're building gas chambers like Hitler, that is too low a threshold. That basically allows all sorts of terrible things to happen without ringing the alarm bells. So one of the uses of history is to allow us to say this is not like that, but it helps us to identify what it is and why it's a problem in its own right.
Okay, let's go back to history now.
Yeah.
When you started off, and for years afterwards, you were among the first American historians of the Holocaust. It was a discipline that was traditionally dominated mainly by German and Jewish and Israeli historians. Since then, some in the English-speaking world have come along, I think most notably Ian Kershaw and others. What do you think is the contribution of the Anglo-American perspective to the study of the Holocaust?
Well, that's I don't know if I'm the right person to ask because that means
You're talking about yourself.
I'm talking more about myself.
It could be a negative contribution as well.
Yeah. Well, let me say when I began, I was kind of a lonely figure. I was the oddball. It had both advantages and disadvantages. Advantages were that I was a curiosity, so at a very young age, very early in my career, I got invited to conferences and chances to give papers and speak because people wanted to check me out.
Really? Do you think that was the reason and not because of the nature of the scholarship? Or some combination?
I mean, I think there was a curiosity as well as, I had written things that people considered good. So then I think I had opportunities that if I'd been in a traditional field, if I'd been writing about the French Revolution as an American, I would not have been
a little harder
invited
to get noticed.
I would have been harder to get noticed. I wouldn't have been brought to France. On the other hand, I spent 2 years here in Jerusalem in the 80s. So there was the benefit of welcoming in someone because coming in from that outside, it helped to validate the field. as someone who was not either a German explaining their own history or a Jew explaining his own history. I was somebody coming in and saying, this is an event that transcends the parochial histories of Germany or of the Jewish people. It is an event of world significance. You can't understand the 20th century if you don't understand this. And I could come and do that as someone who was not either the perpetrator or the victim. And so that sense I gave a kind of validity. For a while, though, however, it also meant there was a glass ceiling that I was useful to have around. But I spent 27 years of my career at a small liberal arts teaching college, not a research university. I had a scholarly record that if it had been elsewhere would have, I think, led to much more quick promotion. But there was no room at the top for somebody who wasn't someone who had the right credentials.
And you mean demographic credentials, identity?
If I was doing Holocaust, I couldn't fill a position in German history. And if I wasn't Jewish, I couldn't fill a position in Jewish history. And there were nothing in between. So I fell between two stools. When I got the job at UNC, I was the first person in the United States who was appointed to fill a German history slot at a research university who had a Holocaust specialization. A year later, Omer Bartov got the job at Brown. So that's when that crumbled. But most of us in our generation were self-taught. There was nobody there who had an expertise in Holocaust. We had to learn our field.
What did you mean really about the politics of research, of which there's always a lot? You said earlier in this conversation that perhaps the two main influences in your early career were Arendt and Raoul Hilberg, who were rather controversial, especially here in Israel. When Ordinary Men came out and when you were doing your research on like micro-history of the Holocaust, on these really normal people, how was it received in Israel?
We were debating, let me just flesh this.
Yes.
We were debating whether this was considered an important book or a deeply controversial book, or both.
I came to Israel shortly after, and they had wasn't open to the public, but they had a morning at Yad Vashem where people from Tel Aviv and Hebrew University could come, and the staff at Yad Vashem. And so it was a significant cross-section of Israeli academics to discuss it. And what I found so fascinating is there was no way to predict who was pro and con. There was no age division. There was no division between university and Yad Vashem. You had, at every age group and every background, some that liked it and some that didn't. So that it was, I just couldn't have beforehand have predicted, and afterwards I could find no pattern as to why individuals, either didn't like it or were very supportive of it. As usual, there are some that thought this was diminishing the motive and importance of anti-Semitism and emphasizing situational factors and the dynamic group pressures over the ideological drive of anti-Semitism as the key motivation. But there were others who surprised me when they found nothing problematic about that at all.
Well, this is a better reception than I can say Hannah Arendt ever got.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about that. I mean, since we're talking about history, let's talk about historiography. I mean, in the talk at Ben Lear and in other places, there's been this discussion about accusatory history in which one scholar accuses the other. I think this was a very prominent part of the edition that I read, where you have an afterword where you discuss Goldhagen's charges. And then you have an approach that you call multi-causal history. Why do we have to have a polarizing narrative about history? Why can't we say there are many factors involved and it's a matter of degree?
That's usually where we end up. But the way in which we get into a new topic is along a particular path. And so quite frequently then that becomes the person who introduces the topic sort of takes one approach, and then there's a kind of dialectic, and it produces an opposite and equal reaction.
Hegelian history. Yeah.
And then you have the fight, and then people begin to realize, well, actually, this is a false dichotomy to characterize a situational, institutional approach for my book and a ideological approach for Goldhagen. Both of these are necessary. These are not mutually exclusive factors, and in fact, they interact and reinforce one another. And so when the smoke finally clears, usually we've come down to that.
Have we come down to that in this case? In terms of where current historical research about the Holocaust is, would you say that's where this particular debate ended up?
In terms of with perpetrators, I would say I think almost anybody would now be saying it is multi-causal, and some of the most interesting case stuff going on now is to look at, in terms of trying to find what are the particular German factors, to look not just at a allegedly particular or unique German anti-Semitism, but what were the other cultural factors that are part of German political culture that Nazis could manipulate, could harness, could mobilize, that made them so susceptible. And so, for instance, Thomas Kuhne at Clark University has written two really remarkable books. One he called Kameradschaft, comradeship. The other was Volksgemeinschaft, or Hitler's community. And the German term Volksgemeinschaft has no English equivalent because it means both a social community and a racial community, an ethnic community. It can mean all of those. In some uses, it's inclusive, and in some, under the Nazis, it becomes exclusive. The Volksgemeinschaft is everybody once you get rid of the Roma and Sinti and the Jews and all the other undesirables, and you're left with your pure German community. But these were terms that had immense emotive power. And comradeship if you read a remark on the, All Quiet on the Western Front, which say, out of World War I, the only good thing that ever came out of it was the comradeship. And this is from a lefty. And so these were terms that the Nazis, that had resonance with everybody in Germany, but the Nazis managed to capture and to distort and to harness. And so there is a bigger, when we talk about the cultural factors, it is more than anti-Semitism. It's anti-Semitism and so I think that's part of where we're filling this in.
But couldn't any nation have their own specific problematic factors?
Yeah. And so it was important for us to understand what were the particular factors in Germany because we're looking at the particular genocide they committed. But if we're planning a genocide elsewhere, if a government, my view is that if any government wants to commit genocide, it won't fail for a lack of willing executioners. There'll never be a bottleneck because you don't find enough people willing to kill on behalf of the government. So they will find what's appropriate for their own political culture to do that. But in this case, we have the Germans doing it, and we have to look at what the political culture is and what is there in addition to anti-Semitism. But we also know, and this is from the social psychologist Leonard Newman, is the situations are culturally created. They're read. There is no such thing as a neutral situation. If you land in the village of Józefów in Poland, you bring with you the glasses of your culture through which you look and read that situation. So you can't simply say it is either culture or situation because the situation itself will be understood culturally. And so I think this is where we've come, is that we understand this is an interaction, that it is much more complex, and it allows us to, I think, unpack all of this in a sort of non-dichotomous, non-polarized way, which is where it usually starts. And you have to get it, if the first person out there will then become whatever they've written will usually draw, as I say, an opposite reaction, and it will get kind of falsely categorized. I was arguing for multi-causal explanation in the book, but because I got attacked by Goldhagen, who was saying, no, it is an anthropological, cultural point, mine became the opposite, became the situational, even though, in fact, it didn't argue that. And then it took a while to sort out and say how, in fact, all of these factors mix together.
Well, the conclusion of all this is really extremely depressing, that we're all capable of committing genocide if we really want to. So let me ask you, I guess, as a possible final question, although maybe Gilad has more. Is there a reverse approach? Can we look at how societies could bring themselves back from the brink, stop themselves from committing atrocities, be at the brink of war and pull back? And what is this research that we go so deep into the social and psychological mentality of committing genocide tell us about how not to commit genocide or any other atrocities or bad things or erosion of democracy or anything bad?
Yeah. I think what we learn is the earlier it stops, the better. And
I like that answer.
And the best defense is to create and preserve a democratic political culture. One where human rights...
Did somebody pay you to be here?
Exactly.
One where human rights are understood and respected. One where this is the purpose for which you have a government. I mean, this is the basis of one goes back to the Declaration of Independence of the United States, that we hold these truths to be settled in heaven. All men are created equal, and they're endowed with certain inalienable rights. And the purpose of government is to preserve and protect those rights. I think that is still is our best answer. I don't think anybody's improved on Thomas Jefferson in terms of what our political, how we should frame our political purpose is than that.
Well, I have one last final question.
This time
actually,
it's you.
No, we should have swapped it because it's a lot less solemn than Dahlia's. Sorry.
I was trying to be super solemn.
Yeah. You mentioned the Volksgemeinschaft approach to the study of the Holocaust. I would just like you to review briefly the current trends in Holocaust scholarship. Where is it going? Or maybe the most interesting ones in your view?
Yeah, I would say first thing I would say, old scholars like me don't know where it's going because that's the prerogative of the young people to discover new questions and new advances. And we will progress because people come along with new ideas and go beyond what we've done. It's not for me to tell them what to do. And
but you know them. You know the next generation. You're up to speed with the work.
Yeah. But I would say the most interesting work now is one that we're going eastward and downward in Europe. That is, now that we are opening up Eastern Europe, we are looking at the much more local level and how the Holocaust plays out in the Ukraine and the Baltic, in former Yugoslavia, where you have a different ethnic mix in each place, and the ways in which those 3- and 4-cornered ethnic relationships, say the Ukraine, where you have Poles and Ukrainians and Jews, and then in 1939 you get the Red Army and the Stalin's occupation, and in 1941 the Germans come. They're the fifth people on the scene. And by the time they get there, the ethnic relations that were there before the collapse of the multi-ethnic empires and the revolution and so forth happened, social relations between the groups have just absolutely been transformed. And the Nazis come in, the gasoline is there. They just light the match and throw it on, and it explodes. But you don't understand how and why it could explode if you don't have the players that are beyond the Jews and the Germans and how that situation has come about over time. And it's different in different places. So Latvia will be different than Lithuania, which will be different than Belarus, will be different than the Ukraine, will be different from Croatia, which is certainly different than Serbia.
As they never fail to remind us.
Yeah. So it's working out those sort of long-term backgrounds, local level, from a point of view of going well beyond just Germans and Jews to look at all the other players that are on the ground and how their interrelationships change over time, that I find the most fascinating new work that is taking place. I think there's other things, certainly as the Holocaust recedes in time, what I've called aftermath studies has developed on all the ramifications of post-45. The killing stopped in 45, but the event in terms of how it shaped our lives since is still there. So that all the cinema and literature that's been produced, the memorials and museums that have been produced,
memory studies,
and how memorials are different in different countries, and countries that don't have memorials or have very distorted memorials, trials, justice, how different countries had different trials at different times is a fascinating topic, and even how in one country that will change over time. Finally, when you have a handful of 90-year-old perpetrators left in Germany, the law has changed to be much more adequate to deal with the crime than it was when you actually had the people there to be tried. And so again, you have a whole different trajectory and story there. So I think the area of aftermath studies is one of our most fascinating ones and most creative. New things are coming up in many ways.
All right, Professor Christopher Browning, thank you very much for joining us today.
Very welcome. I enjoyed it.
And many thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shalem and Georgia Foscarini, our producers, and the Van Leer Institute and the Israel Institute for the generous support. And now we'll have a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. That's in the ratings and the review section on your podcast app. You too can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 500 interviews. And if you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. Don't forget to follow me and Dalia on Twitter. And of course, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.